Welcome back to lecture number 18. This is topic 3.3, Taxation Without Representation. The theme that we're looking at is America in the world and how the colonists are going to be reacting to these imperial policies that the British are placing on them. The learning objective for today is to explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. The first key concept is kind of long and it's going to take us a couple of slides to get through it, but it says the imperial struggles of the mid-18th century as well as new British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent and to assert imperial authority in the colonies began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. Let's begin here with the representation that the colonists were seeking in Parliament. They wanted direct representation. That means that they wanted to elect members of Parliament that would directly represent their interests of the people living in the colonies. The parliamentary response to this was that the colonists were already being represented in Parliament by virtue of virtual representation. This means that Parliament already represents the interest of all British subjects, regardless of whether or not they had an opportunity to vote for those members of Parliament. In fact, people that had the ability to vote in England and the rest of the British Empire was much lower than the amount of people that were able to vote for colonial legislatures in the colonies. This goes along with the perceived constraints that the colonists felt they had placed on them. They actually were paying lower taxes than people in England, and they actually had greater opportunities in the colonies to get land and to have their voices represented. But nevertheless, they wanted direct representation. Some of the constraints that were real, that clearly affected them, included the Proclamation of 1763. This was the line that forbade the colonists from going further west into the territory that was won as a result of the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act we talked about in the last lecture, and all of these were instances in which they were being directly affected by these colonial policies. The Stamp Act was heavily boycotted and heavily protested, and eventually it was repealed before it went into effect. After the Stamp Act was repealed, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act of 1766 to save face. It essentially said that Parliament still has control over the British Empire, and if they want to in the future, they can pass another tax that can affect the colonies, and they can't do anything about it. So in 1767, they passed more of these taxes on paper, glass, and tea, and they were meant to pay for the salaries of the British officials in the colonies. The main reason for this was that they wanted to make colonial legislatures less powerful over the salaries of these officials and give them more independence. Thus, the colonies would have less power or less control over their own affairs. Eventually, the Townshend Acts are repealed by the next Prime Minister, Lord North. The resulting boycotts were having a negative impact on the trade between England and the colonies. Also, the revenue that was being collected as a result of the Townshend Acts was not enough to really compensate for the loss of that trade. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act and was not necessarily directed at the colonies, but it did end up affecting the colonies in a good way. The British East India Company, which was struggling financially, was being bailed out by Parliament and are given a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. That means that the only tea that the colonists could buy had to come from the British East India Company, and even though the tea had a tax attached to it, it was still cheaper than the tea that was being smuggled from Dutch ships or from French ships. Colonists in Boston were angry over this because they didn't care if the price of tea was cheaper, they were the ones that were importing the tea from elsewhere, so the artificial monopoly created by Parliament was cutting into their business. Tensions escalated when the first East India Company ship comes into Boston Harbor. Colonists refused the tea to be unloaded and refused delivery of it, so the tea is just sitting on the ships and it leads to the Boston Tea Party. Members of the Sons of Liberty get onto these ships that were being held up at Boston Harbor, and they throw the crates of tea overboard into the sea. It's more likely that the Bostonians who were benefiting from the smuggling of Dutch tea were the ones that were leading this protest because it wouldn't make sense for the colonists to rebel against the tea tax, if it was essentially making the tea that they were drinking a lot cheaper. Britain was angry over the Boston Tea Party and they passed the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they become known as the Intolerable Acts. They were meant to punish Boston for their part in the destruction of the tea. They closed down the port of Boston, and they say that they won't reopen it until the tea has been paid for. Obviously, the colonists are indignant, and they're not going to pay for the tea. Meanwhile, independently of the Coercive Acts, Parliament passes the Quebec Act. It organizes the rest of the Quebec territory. This is formerly French Canada, and it was gained after the French and Indian War. It extends the boundary for Quebec down to the Ohio River Valley, and it establishes Catholicism as the official religion in that territory. That angered the colonists in two different ways. The first is that they don't like Catholicism. Remember that the colonies have a very strong Protestant background. The second is that they felt that the French settlers that were still living there were being awarded the land that the colonists had fought for in the French and Indian War. The colonies of Virginia, New York, and Pennsylvania all had claims to the land that was being given away. Lastly, we have Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Lord Dunmore was a British official in Virginia, and as Virginia was starting to become more antagonistic to British rule, he tries to maintain martial law by promising the emancipation for any enslaved person who was willing to join the British Army and put down an uprising. That really angered the people in Virginia because slavery had played such a large part in their economy and felt that Britain would threaten their livelihood to maintain control. Here's a larger map showing the effects of the Quebec Act. The area in the Midwest becomes the territory of Quebec, and then everything below the Ohio River Valley, according to the Proclamation of 1763, had become Indian Reserve. The colonists were back to where they started before the French and Indian War in terms of opportunities for movement, and they were not happy about it. Moving on to the second key concept. Colonial leaders based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about the rights of British subjects, the rights of the individual, local traditions of self-rule, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. Arguments against direct and indirect taxation on the colonies were based on all of these, especially self-rule and the Enlightenment. Colonists vocalized their views in many different pamphlets. The most famous at the time was a letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania by John Dickinson. He argued mostly about the concept of taxation without representation. There was also the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which was written by the Massachusetts Colonial Legislature. Sam Adams and James Otis called for the legislatures to petition for Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts and leads to troops being sent to Boston Harbor. On the bottom right, you see a sketch by Paul Revere of what it looked like when the British troops came in. The third key concept says the efforts of American independence was energized by colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, as well as by popular movements that included the political activism of laborers, artisans, and women. Benjamin Franklin was the most prominent self-made colonial leader who made his fortune in publishing. He published a new edition of his Poor Richard's Almanac every year, so he had the money and resources to voice his views on England to a large proportion of the colonies. The political cartoon on the top right was drawn and published as a way to protest the Stamp Act. The colonies are depicted as having lost their limbs as a result of this tax. While the cartoon may seem overdramatic, remember Ben Franklin was a publisher and a printer. If the Stamp Act was put in place then, he would be required to pay a considerable amount of money for stamps to cover for each almanac he printed. There was also an attempt at calling for a wider boycott of the Stamp Act that was seen in through the Stamp Act Congress. The activities of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty in the colonies was also significant in uniting the colonists in resistance. They would sign non-importation agreements and boycotts of British goods. Sometimes they forced merchants to sign them and used violence against those who did not ascribe to these boycotts. Spinning bees by colonial women were meant to create textiles here in the colonies so that they wouldn't have to purchase it from England. England was in its early stages of an industrial revolution that revolved around the textile industry. It relied on its colonial holdings to purchase the finished goods it made. The economic impact of these boycotts and non-importation agreements were strong enough to have Parliament repeal the Stamp Act. Later on, when the Townshend Acts were passed, more colonial resistance comes about, similar to the ones that was seen during the Stamp Act resistance. There are non-importation agreements once again, and in Boston this escalates into the Boston Massacre. While British troops drilled in Boston Commons, members of the Sons of Liberty begin to harass the soldiers and throw snowballs. The British retaliate and fire into the crowd, killing some of the colonists, and Crispus Attucks, who is normally seen as the first casualty of the independence movement, was one such casualty. He was of mixed African and Indian descent. Unruly behavior from the Sons of Liberty was common. For example, tarring and feathering of tax collectors to intimidate them into not enforcing imperial policies, and vandalizing property of merchants who would not abide by the boycott. The final key concept says, in the face of economic shortages and the British military occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial and material support to the Patriot movement. Here's when we want to focus on women a little bit more. Because the non-importation agreements and the boycotts disproportionately affected them, all of the finished goods that were coming from England now had to be replaced by manufactured goods from home. So women had to spend extra time on top of their other duties creating the goods that they could not purchase from England in order to maintain loyalty to this resistance movement. Smuggling was common in the colonies due to the lax enforcement of the early Navigation Acts. Smugglers had the incentive to get imperial policies revealed as well. John Hancock in Boston had been known for his smuggling and his resistance to these British imperial policies. When Parliament introduces the Tea Act that gives the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade and also begins to enforce the Navigation Acts once again, merchants like Hancock are the most heavily impacted. Alright, here is a final recap for you. Colonists begin to unite over British imperial policies. Colonial resistance was based on ideas of the Enlightenment and self-government traditions. And resistance to British policies came from diverse groups: rich, poor, women, and men. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you are looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.